You know, we've all heard the phrase, before an operation, the doctor says they're gonna put you to sleep. Sounds nice and comforting, right? Like you're just gonna have a really, really good nap. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if the state we go into is actually something way deeper and honestly a lot more mysterious? Because the truth is, the simple story we tell ourselves about anesthesia, well, it's wrong.
And this quote right here just cuts straight to the heart of it. Dr. Emery Brown, who's both an anesthesiologist and a neuroscientist, he's not mincing words. Because that state of general anesthesia, it isn't sleep. It's a carefully controlled, temporary trip into a state that is much, much closer to a coma.
So let's just say it plainly. General anesthesia is a drug-induced reversible coma. And that's not just for dramatic fact, it's a physiological fact. And the evidence becomes just crystal clear when you actually compare it side by side with natural sleep.
Okay, so just look at this. The differences are absolutely staggering. You can be woken up from sleep by a loud noise, right? But under general anesthesia, not a chance. Your brain's metabolism drops by over half. That's more than double the drop you see in sleep. And here's the real kicker. It has zero restorative value. You can be under for 10 hours, and you'd wake up with the exact same sleep debt you had before. Your brain isn't resting. It's been silenced.
So, if it's not sleep, then what in the world is it? Well, the secret isn't about just turning down the volume on individual brain cells. No, it's about taking down the entire communication grid. It's like silencing a symphony. Not by taking away the violins and the trumpets, but by firing the conductor. You sever the coordinated activity that creates the music of consciousness itself.
The leading theory for how this all works has a pretty fancy name, the cognitive unbinding hypothesis. But the idea is actually pretty simple. Think about your experience right now. You're seeing this slide, you're hearing my voice, maybe you're feeling the temperature in the room. Your brain seamlessly binds all that separate information into one unified conscious moment. Anesthesia works by just shattering that binding process.
And here's how that unbinding actually happens. Get this, sensory information, like the sound of a surgeon's voice. It might still reach the hearing center of your brain. Your ear is still technically hearing. But the critical communication lines, the feedback loops that connect that sensory area to the front of your brain, the part that gives you awareness, those lines are cut. What you get are these isolated islands of brain activity. There's data coming in, but there's literally no one home to observe it.
Dr. Emery Brown uses another amazing metaphor to describe the state. He calls it oscillatory handcuffs. See, instead of the rich, complex, chaotic chatter that happens between different brain regions when you're awake, anesthesia forces the entire brain into this one rigid, super-synchronized rhythm. This pattern, which you can see clearly on a brain scan, basically acts like a jamming signal, making it impossible for different parts of the brain to share information. And without that sharing, consciousness just can't happen. So we've seen the big picture, the network getting shut down. But now let's zoom way in, down to the microscopic level. How do these drugs actually put those handcuffs on the brain? The answer is hiding on the surface of your individual neurons, in tiny little proteins.
For 100 years, scientists believed in something called the lipid theory. The idea was basically that anesthetics just kind of dissolved in the fatty membrane of brain cells, gumming up the works like a blunt instrument. But that theory couldn't explain some really weird things, like why two molecules that were perfect mirror images of each other could have totally different effects. The modern protein theory, though, it shows us it's not a blunt instrument at all. It's a precise key, fitting perfectly into a specific lock on a protein.
And modern drugs use this kind of three-pronged attack to get the job done. First, they boost the brain's main off switch. Drugs like propofol make these things called GABA receptors supersensitive, making it way harder for neurons to fire. Second, they block the on switches. So drugs like ketamine literally just plug up the receptors that get neurons excited. And third, those inhaled gases, they basically pull the plug, opening up these leak channels that let all the positive energy drain right out of the neuron.
Okay, so this is an incredibly complex, fine-tuned dance, right? And because it's so complex, sometimes, on very, very rare occasions, it can fail. And this brings us to the absolutely terrifying reality of accidental awareness during general anesthesia. There was this massive landmark study called NAP5. It looked at over 3 million cases of anesthesia, and it found that the rate of patient-reported awareness is about 1 in 19,000. Now, I know that number is statistically tiny, but for the person who happens to be that one, it's a catastrophic, unimaginable failure.
Donna Penna was one of those patients. She was paralyzed by muscle relaxants,
but was completely conscious on the operating table. And she heard the surgeon ask for the scalpel. And then, unable to scream, unable to move a single muscle, she felt it cut into her stomach.
And the NAP5 study revealed that for many survivors, the absolute worst part is the feeling of being paralyzed, of being trapped in your own body and unable to signal for help. More than half of the people who experience this suffer from long-term psychological trauma like PTSD. And what's just so unnerving is that the standard monitors, heart rate, blood pressure, they don't always show that the patient is awake and in absolute terror.
This terrifying reality is exactly why the science is pushing forward so fast. And you know, one of the most exciting new frontiers isn't even about how we go under, but about how we come back, moving past just letting the drugs passively wear off. It turns out the brain has this property called neural inertia. It actually resists changing its state. Think about it like trying to push a giant heavy ball. It takes a huge shove to get it rolling, but a lot less force to just keep it going. Well, it's kind of the same with the brain. It takes a higher concentration of a drug to knock you out than the level at which you'll eventually wake up. The brain essentially gets stuck in that unconscious state.
So the future isn't about just waiting for that anesthetic fog to clear. It's something they're calling active reanimation. This is a revolutionary idea. It involves using other drugs to actively stimulate the brain's own natural wake-up centers to essentially jumpstart consciousness and force the brain out of that inert state. How cool is that?
We're also getting so much closer to making anesthesia a deeply personal thing. Using a field called pharmacogenomics, we can actually look at your genetic code to predict how you'll respond. We can screen for gene mutations that might cause a lethal reaction, or we can check for other genes that tell us if you're going to burn through a drug like propofol really fast or really slow. This lets doctors tailor the dose perfectly for you, making the whole thing safer and way more precise.
You know, all of this incredible research forces us to ask this really fundamental question. When you emerge from that oblivion of anesthesia, how does your mind actually reboot? It's not like flipping a light switch back on. It is a complex, biological restart of the most sophisticated machine in the known universe, one that has to reweave the very fabric of your reality from scratch. And in the end, maybe the greatest mystery of all isn't how these drugs can temporarily dissolve our consciousness. As Dr. George Mashore puts it so beautifully, the real marvel is that time and time again, from that profound abyss, the human brain finds its way back, reconnects its symphony, and rebuilds our entire world.